The man who spent 17 seasons telling the world that Roloff Farms was his family's greatest legacy is the exact reason his family doesn't have it today. Think about that for a second. 109 acres, decades of memories, a name that millions of Americans welcomed into their living rooms every single week. And at the end of it all, when the cameras stopped being quite so flattering and the contracts got uncomfortable, the farm that was always described as a gift to the next generation went up for sale to the highest bidder. Not to Zach, not to Jeremy, not to any Roloff who grew up chasing each other through those orchards, to strangers. And Matt Roloff stood in front of a camera, looked directly into the lens, and told the world he tried everything he could. This is the story of what everything actually looked like behind the scenes. If this kind of deep dive content is what you've been looking for, the stuff the show never had the nerve to say out loud, hit that like button right now and subscribe to LPBW Update. We don't do surface level here. Let's get into it. To understand how this story ends, you have to understand how it began, and more importantly, how it was sold to you. Because for 17 seasons, the producers of Little People, Big World understood something very clearly. The farm wasn't just a location, it was the emotional anchor of the entire show. It was the thing that made you keep coming back. You weren't just watching a family navigate dwarfism, marriage, and everyday life. You were watching people build something. You were watching a man pour his vision into the soil and watch it grow into something extraordinary. And Matt Roloff was genuinely extraordinary at building things. You have to give him that. The pirate ship, the zip lines, the trebuchet, the haunted barn. Every single pumpkin season, this man would conceive of something ambitious, gather his family around it, and make it real. He had a gift, and the show made sure you knew it. Early seasons of Little People, Big World leaned heavily into Matt as the visionary patriarch, the man who refused to let his physical limitations shrink his dreams. That was a powerful story. It was an inspiring story, and millions of people bought into it completely, including his own children. Here's what the show was less interested in exploring, at least in those early years. Who held the power? Because while the farm was framed as a family project, something all of them were building together, the legal and financial structure of it was never ambiguous. Matt held the deed. Matt controlled the finances. Amy managed the household, raised 4 kids, and contributed enormously to what the farm became. The kids provided labor, participated in pumpkin seasons, and grew up in front of the cameras. But when it came to the actual ownership of that land, that was Matt's domain. And for a long time, that didn't seem to matter, because the story being told was one of togetherness, one of shared purpose, one of legacy. But here's the question nobody was really asking in those early seasons. Can something belong to a family if only one person in that family has the legal right to keep it or sell it? Because that question turns out to be the entire ballgame. The first real crack in the foundation didn't come from a business deal or a contract dispute. It came from the marriage falling apart. Matt and Amy's divorce, which played out across multiple seasons of the show starting around 2016, was difficult to watch. Not because it was dramatic in a tabloid sense, but because you could see 2 people who had built an enormous life together, suddenly having to figure out what that life was worth and who it belonged to. And the farm sat right in the middle of that reckoning. When they divided their assets, Amy received a portion of the property, but eventually she sold her half back to Matt. Now, Amy has spoken about this publicly and on camera. She's described feeling like it was the right decision at the time, a way to move forward cleanly. And you can understand that perspective. When a marriage ends, sometimes you just need out. Sometimes the symbol of everything you built together is the last thing you want to keep fighting over. So she sold it, and Matt bought it. And suddenly, the man who had always informally controlled the farm now legally controlled all of it. This is the moment that, looking back, changed everything. Not because it was wrong for Matt to buy Amy out. Legally and practically, you could argue it made sense. But because it meant that from that point forward, every promise Matt had made about the farm's future was entirely his to keep or break. There was no shared ownership, no co-decision making. It was his land, his asset, his call. And if you believed, as Zach and Jeremy and Tori clearly did, that those promises still meant something, you were operating on faith. And faith, it turns out, is not a legally binding contract. Now we need to talk about the promises, because this is where it gets really important, and this is where the emotional weight of what happened later becomes almost impossible to overstate. Over the course of the show, across confessionals and interviews and social media posts and casual on-camera conversations, Matt Roloff said, in various forms, in various contexts, that he wanted the farm to stay in the family, that he wanted his kids to have it, that the whole point of building something this significant was so it could be passed down. These weren't vague implications, they were direct statements. Zach has talked about growing up with the genuine belief that the farm was going to be part of his future. Tori believed it, Jeremy believed it, and the audience believed it because they had been watching this family for over a decade and had no reason not to. This matters so much because it's the difference between a business deal and a betrayal. If Matt had never said a word about legacy, never implied the farm was destined for his children, and simply treated it as his personal investment property from day one, you could debate his choices all you want, but you couldn't call it a broken promise. But that's not what happened. What happened is that a wall of expectation was built, brick by brick, year by year, in front of millions of viewers. And then in 2022, that wall came down. The 2022 negotiation is the gut punch at the center of this whole story. And the more you look at the specific details of what happened, the harder it is to frame it the way Matt has tried to frame it. Here's the basic shape of it. Matt offered Zach the opportunity to buy the farm. And on the surface, that sounds like a father making good on his word. He gave his son the chance to keep it in the family. What more could you ask for? Except the price. The price is everything. Matt offered Zach the farm at market rate, the full going price for a 109-acre property in the Willamette Valley, one of the most sought-after agricultural regions in the Pacific Northwest. We're talking about a number that would be challenging for most upper-middle-class families, let alone a single-income household trying to manage the very specific and very real financial demands that come with raising 3 children, 2 of whom have dwarfism, a condition that carries significant ongoing medical costs. There was no family discount, no legacy consideration, no arrangement to make the numbers work for the people who had spent their entire lives being told this place was partly theirs. And when Zach couldn't meet that number, which, let's be honest, was almost a foregone conclusion given the financial reality, Matt went on camera and described it as an opportunity he had tried to give his son. He expressed hurt. He said he had done everything he could. He used language that positioned him as a father who had been left with no choice. I gave them every opportunity. That's a sentence worth sitting with for a moment, because what does every opportunity mean when the opportunity is priced out of reach? Is that an opportunity, or is it the performance of one? Watch the contrast between what Matt said on camera and what Zach and Tori said on camera during that same period. They're not even describing the same negotiation. Tori, who is famously measured and careful with her words, was clearly devastated. Zach was angry in the way people get angry when they feel like the ground has been pulled out from under them. Not dramatic anger, quiet, settled, we know what happened anger. And then they moved to Washington, packed up their family, and left Oregon. When people are hurt, they don't stay close to the source of the pain. Jacob Roloff said almost nothing publicly about the farm situation, and sometimes silence is the loudest thing in the room. Jacob has always been the most forthright Roloff child when it comes to naming difficult truths about his upbringing. He's written about it, he's spoken about it, he's been consistent. So when Jacob chose not to engage with the farm drama publicly, it's worth asking what that silence is protecting and what it's communicating. Some people read it as staying out of the conflict. Others read it as knowing something he's decided not to say. Jeremy, for his part, had his own failed negotiation with his father over the farm. He and Audrey had also expressed interest in purchasing the property and also walked away without a deal. 2 sons, 2 attempts, 2 outcomes that didn't involve Roloff inheriting What they had been told for years was their inheritance. Now, here's where the story gets a layer more complicated, and where you need to pay attention to the timeline, because timelines have a way of asking questions that people don't always want to answer. At some point during and after Matt's divorce from Amy, Karen Chandler, who had worked on the farm in a management capacity, transitioned from employee to girlfriend to fiancé. And Karen's involvement in the farm's operations became increasingly visible and increasingly central. She was at events. She was involved in decision-making. She was, by all appearances, building a life at Roloff Farms alongside Matt. Now, none of that is inherently problematic. People fall in love. People move on after divorce. That's human and it's normal, and nobody should be condemned for it. But here's the question the timeline raises, and it's a fair question to ask. At what point did Matt's vision for the farm's future stop being about his sons and start being about a different future entirely? Because if you map out when Karen's role expanded, when the sons' negotiations fell apart, when the property was eventually listed for sale, and when Matt began building a new life with a new partner, a pattern emerges that is at least worth examining, not as an accusation, but as a question. Was the farm always heading toward this? And if so, was the language about legacy and inheritance something Matt genuinely believed, or something that sounded good on a reality television show? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're the questions that viewers who watch this family for 17 years deserve to have asked out loud. Here's something that this story connects to that goes way beyond the Roloffs, and this is the part that I think is going to hit some of you personally. Family businesses and inherited property are one of the most reliable sources of lasting damage in family relationships, and the damage almost always follows the same pattern. A parent builds something significant. The children grow up understanding, either explicitly or implicitly, that this thing is part of their future. And then at some point, sometimes due to a new relationship, sometimes due to financial pressure, sometimes due to control issues that were always there but never named, the thing doesn't get passed down the way everyone expected. And the parent, rather than acknowledging that the expectation was real and that something was lost, reframes the narrative. They describe themselves as reasonable. They describe the children as having had every chance. They say they did everything they could, and the children are left holding something that doesn't have a clean name, because it's not quite inheritance, and it's not quite theft, and it's not quite betrayal, but it feels like all three. How many of you watching this right now have been in a version of that situation? Maybe it wasn't a farm, maybe it was a business, a house, a family heirloom, a promised loan that quietly became a condition attached to something else entirely. The Roloff story resonates with so many people not just because it was on television, but because it rhymes with something real in their own families. Leave a comment below. Tell me if this pattern sounds familiar, because I think it does for more people than are usually willing to admit it. Let's come back to Matt's public persona in the aftermath of all of this, because here's what's interesting. And I want you to watch this carefully because it's a masterclass in narrative control. After the farm negotiations collapsed, after Zach and Tori moved to Washington, after the family fracture became publicly visible, Matt Roloff did not go quiet. He did not take time away from the camera. He kept posting. He kept giving tours of the farm. He kept documenting his life with Karen. He kept showing up on social media with the energy of a man who was genuinely enjoying his life. And in interviews and confessionals, he returned again and again to the language of someone who had been misunderstood, someone who had tried, someone who had been hurt by how things were portrayed. And here's the thing, he was effective. There is a significant portion of the Little People Big World audience that came away from this situation feeling sympathetic toward Matt, feeling like he was a father who had bent over backward and still gotten criticized for it. And that's not an accident. Matt Roloff understands camera presence in a way that very few reality television personalities do. He's had 17 seasons of practice at knowing which version of himself to put in front of a lens. He knows how to look wounded. He knows how to sound reasonable. He knows that if you say, "I gave them every opportunity," with enough sincerity, a lot of people will take you at your word. But look at the post-fallout content again with clear eyes. A man who genuinely grieved the loss of closeness with his sons, who felt real pain about a family being divided, would carry that grief differently. It would show up somewhere, in the quiet moments, in what he doesn't post about. Instead, what you see is a man who appears to have gotten exactly the life he wanted, the farm under his control, a new chapter with the partner he chose, new projects, new builds, new things to be excited about. That doesn't mean he feels nothing, but it does raise the question, what exactly is the grief for? And then there's what the show chose not to tell you. Because Little People, Big World, for all its years on the air, was still a produced television program with relationships to protect and stories to manage. There are things that never made it into an episode. There are conversations that happened off camera. There are financial arrangements and legal documents and private negotiations that the audience will never fully see. What we can do is look at publicly available information, property records, social media timelines, on-camera statements cross-referenced against each other, and ask whether the story we were shown holds together. And in a number of places, it doesn't quite. The seams show. The timelines create questions that the show never bothered to answer. That's not a conspiracy, that's just how produced television works. Nobody is suggesting that Little People, Big World was fabricating events, but there is a significant difference between what happened and what was shown, and in the gap between those two things lives the real story of Roloff Farms. So let's bring this all the way back to the question we started with. Was Matt Roloff the victim here, or was he the architect? And the honest answer, the answer that actually respects the complexity of this situation, is that those two things are not mutually exclusive. People can genuinely believe they are doing right by their family while also making choices that serve themselves first. People can feel hurt and be the primary cause of the hurt simultaneously. People can tell themselves a story about their own generosity for long enough that they start to believe it completely, even when the facts on the ground tell a different story. Matt Roloff is not a cartoon villain. He built something genuinely remarkable. He raised children in front of the entire country and navigated a level of public scrutiny that most of us will never experience. He dealt with the end of a long marriage on camera. None of that is easy. None of that should be dismissed. But also, and this matters, none of that excuses what happened in 2022. None of it makes market rate with no family consideration an act of generosity. None of it makes two failed negotiations and a for sale sign a legacy fulfilled. The farm is gone from the family now. That's the reality. And the question the audience has to sit with, the question that 17 seasons of investment in these people ultimately leads to, is whether the man who spent all those years saying it was for his family actually meant it. Or whether the camera was always the real audience and the family was always just the content. Drop your answer in the comments right now. Do you think Matt Roloff ever truly intended to pass that farm to his sons? Because based on everything, the promises, the price, the timing, the new life he built on that same land, I think a lot of you already know what you believe. And I think the reason this story still hits so hard, years after the negotiations fell apart, is because it's not really about a farm at all. It's about what parents owe their children when they've made promises in public and private across decades. It's about the difference between building a legacy and building a story about a legacy. And it's about how much we're willing to see when the cameras are pointed at someone we've chosen to trust. If you've been watching this family for years and never quite saw this pattern laid out clearly, that's exactly how it was designed to look. That's the whole point. And if you're new here and this is the first video of ours you found, welcome. Subscribe right now because this is what we do. We take the stories you've been watching for years and we show you what's actually in them. The Roloffs aren't done. There's more to come. And we'll be here when it does.